Well, here I am for episode 2 on season 2 podcast Trauma Resonance Resilience. And as I start off every podcast describing my utmost excitement with who I'm going to speak to, today I'm really excited to be speaking to Dr. Karen Treisman.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, although that seems a little bit like a dim and distant memory, but yes, Happy New Year.
I'm with you. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful, and it's great because actually episode 1 we had Mike Clark talking about you, saying he was writing a poem. He said, I'm writing a poem, it's going to be published by Dr. Treisman. And we all went, Karen's going to publish your poem. So we had a little bit of, so I know you've been really busy the last couple of days, but if you get a chance, you'll get to hear this poem that's going to be.
I'm definitely going to read it. I'm so excited to have him part of the book. I think he actually might do a couple. So when I saw him performing on YouTube, I just thought how incredible he was. So very excited he agreed to it. And I'm going to listen to the podcast later.
Brilliant. So Karen, for those of you that don't know Karen, which can't be huge amounts of people, to be honest, Karen is a clinical psychologist, but actually a national and international trainer on trauma and trauma responsive nurse, culturally responsive, trauma infused organisations. So, but I'm going to let you talk a bit more about that, because I think we've been connected for a long time, and I've really watched a shift in, as we all do, and as we're all growing, a shift in how you want to frame and how you want to think about working around trauma. So when we first connected, I think that we weren't really thinking quite so much organisationally as we are now, which is fantastic. So I just love watching that trajectory. So where are you at? Where are you at right now? What's going on in the world of Karen?
I think you're right in terms of I have had quite a big shift more towards the organisational stuff, which wasn't necessarily a conscious plan, but I think it's just I've travelled that way. So I guess I've always been really interested in systems, in terms of systems theory, and I've worked in lots of different systems. I started a lot of my career working in residential homes, and often was thinking these are traumatized systems, but I didn't know what that was. I just had a sense of it. And then I was working in lots of different local authorities, going into prisons, going into schools, and I was doing lots of work around individual trauma, which I'm still incredibly passionate about, and therapy. And at one point I was working with 70 children therapeutically, but I kept on being aware of how the adults were responding, but also around staff well-being, and also looking at some of the pitting against each other, CAMS against social services, and also organisations that were adding to someone's trauma, that were re-traumatising someone, having to take people to the Home Office, and how horrific it was seeing schools who were excluding young people over and over and over again. And so I started becoming much more interested. And then just as the work progressed, I was thinking, I'm doing so much stuff, but actually, where is going to make the biggest impact and the biggest ripple? And it kept on coming back to organisations. And then I think it's quite personal. The last one which really pushed me, I'd worked in an implementation science team at the Maudsley, which was about implementing strategies nationally, and done lots of work about systems. But then my last local authority I worked in was the most traumatizing system that I've worked in. I dreaded going to work. I was physically unwell with pneumonia. I was in a place of not wanting to be a practitioner anymore. It completely took someone like me who is so passionate and so committed, and I watched my whole team really being impacted. And once I left that job, I really wanted to look a lot more about it. And so that really took me to apply to do the Winston Churchill Fellowship. And the Winston Churchill Fellowship is an amazing opportunity for people who don't know about it. And I basically applied and managed to go to America to have over 150 meetings with people across 14 different cities in America about actually what is trauma culturally and adversely informed and responsive organizational transformation. What would they do differently? What does that look like? What were the biggest barriers, success? And that's just opened up a whole new world to me, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, I've certainly very much been focused on organisations because I don't come via that clinical psychology route where you were grappling with the work. And I certainly remember feeling like there's only so far that you can actually go when you're working with individuals, because we don't operate as individuals. You know, what's all the other stuff that's going on around us? And so that for me was really exciting, that you had that opportunity to really think about how do we then shift organizations in a really meaningful way. And I'm really curious about, perhaps we could unpick what some of those key things are, because there are things that I talk to organizations about that, because people are working in them all the time, they don't notice. So for example, really blunt example, I was doing some work with alcohol and drug services and within a health context. And some of the posters that they have on the wall are horrific. I mean, you're greeted as you go into these buildings with some of the most awful posters that are meant to be about helping and supporting people to somehow think about whatever's going on for them, to do something differently. Or you've got people coming in to use services where all the posters on the walls are about drug use.
Completely.
And so there's a real disconnect in understanding the power of changing the narrative and giving people a different narrative. I mean, does that, I mean, you come from a health setting. I mean, I don't come from a health setting. So I was quite, and you know, believe me, education and social work is full of its own stuff, but working in a health setting for really the first time, I was quite sort of taken aback by that. I mean, so just the things we have around us are things that people get so used to being around, aren't they?
Huge. And people get very marinated in being in that environment. And I think, in fact, the event I was doing yesterday, we ended up spending almost the whole day talking about physical environment for exactly that reason. Things from, as you say, the posters you see, to who welcomes you at the door and how someone makes you feel, to how to find a room, how stressful it is when someone's go left, go up the stairs, go the second right, then to the, what feeling that leaves someone with, let alone someone who's in a heightened state or feeling triggered or feeling unsafe, but also thinking about what message it gives about, we're going to look after you, we're going to make you feel safe. Sometimes the simplest things like water in a tank. How often you go to the hospital and you're waiting for your appointment and there's no water in the tank, and then there's this posters with, as you say, no, don't, stop. Just how it makes you feel supported and looked after. So absolutely, the materials, what the language and the words on people's website and on brochures and materials, what that's like. I did a walkthrough through a CAM service the other day with some kids, and one of the first things one of the children picked up, which was just brilliant, is but none of the puzzles have all the pieces.
Yeah.
And you just think those small things which I hadn't thought to open the puzzles and put them together, but this child was like, if I'm going to be sitting in the waiting room and all I've got is to play with this puzzle, I want all the pieces. And metaphorically, that's quite a huge thing, isn't it?
Well, metaphorically, it's raised the hairs on my arm. I mean, that's just like wild. You know, we don't have all the pieces.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then these are people who you're hoping to go to. And that's forgetting the stuff that is often happening, which is re-traumatizing people, you know, having to tell your story in graphic detail to 10 different professionals, having to feeling like you're just a number and not a person, or just being seen as a difficulty, or through a deficit lens. Having I was working a few years back in a psychiatric hospital, and there was a lady who I'd been working with from Miranda, and who had been horrifically raped by people who she identified as by the Hutu tribe, and an interpreter had been called, and no one had thought about the choice of interpreter, and this big man who clearly identified as the Hutu tribe turned up, and all I heard was her screaming in the corridor. It's those things that are helping people think about what might that feel, what might it feel like to put a child who's experienced relational poverty and relational starvation in a room that is just white walls and full of feeling that deprivation again. So I think a lot of it is, it's, you know, there's the 4 R's of trauma-informed practice, but the third R to me is the most important. How do we resist re-traumatizing or adding harm? How do we not be trauma-inducing and try and be trauma-reducing? So it's, and all of those things, like you say, like the signs and the people, and filling in an assessment form. You know, how is that done? How does it make people feel? How culturally responsive is it? What's going to happen with it? All of those tiny things make a massive difference. So a lot of the work is, yes, there's the big values, there's the big principles, there's helping systems understand what it means to be in a traumatized system. But then it's getting people to think. Yesterday we were talking about, what do you do in your team meetings? Do you have fidget toys in your team meetings? Do you do connecting activities? Do you have a moment of silence? What can you do that models the model? So it's all, it's big stuff and the small stuff. You know?
Absolutely. And just kind of really moving from that theme, because I'm really interested in people's resistance, as opposed to my relational activism resistance, but people's resistance. And the reason I think it'd be really good to have a conversation about that is because this week alone, we've had there's been a lot of noise about mental health scores, isolation, and some of the discussion that I observe. And I try not to get too caught up in it on Twitter, to be honest, because it's such a polarized space. The grey area of it is really difficult for people. But what I see is denial. I see resistance. I see a lack of curiosity, and I'm curious about what that is about. Why is there a resistance to the idea that for some people, I mean, we might argue, you know, none of us are going to fare well in that kind of scenario, but for the purposes of thinking about more vulnerable children in very mainstream settings like mainstream school, what is that resistance born out of, and how are we going to work with that in a way that brings people towards us, rather than what I see on Twitter, which is that it pushes people apart?
Absolutely. I think that's a huge thing. And I think, to me, and it's easier said than done, because don't worry, I also get very infuriated. I suppose I bring everything back to being a therapist. And when you've got a child you are working with who is not in the place where you would potentially hope or want for them to be, or you've got a child who's effing and blinding at you, or slamming the door in your face, or putting a hood over, you look as a therapist and you think, what is that behavior communicating? Yeah, let's be curious instead of furious. What are they trying to tell me? And generally we know it's from a place of pain or hurt or sadness or fear of loss. What's going to happen if I invest in this? What's going to happen? And it's coming from a place of people trying to cope and survive and protect themselves. And people are fighting for something. That might be something different that I'm fighting for. And so in therapy, you work in whichever way you can to try and honour that person's position and space and value, and try and support them to come on that journey with you. But you don't push or shove someone on the journey, because if you push someone, they just push back. And I think, to me, it's the same as people in Twitter, it's the same as organizations. When I'm going into organizations and I've got a group of people who are just like, this is rubbish, this is candy floss, this isn't going to make a difference, I've been doing this for 30 years. I always try and think, rather than, well, I'm right and come on my way, I always try and think, what is it that's creating that hesitance, that caution? What is it that people are holding on to? What is the language or the values that people are anchoring on, and try and be curious instead of furious, because actually there's a reason that people are anchoring on, and change is really scary. Change is really hard. Change means that everything I've been doing before is being threatened. And so to me, I think it's also about how do we help people gently move on that journey, but also honoring why they're in that place, and spending more time and energy on the people who really do want to do it. Because actually what we notice is the ripples, you've got those like champions, don't you, and those cheerleaders, and the more energy you put in the champions and the cheerleaders, the people slightly in the middle start moving, and by osmosis the other people start sort of coming that way. But it takes time. I always use a metaphor when I talk to organizations about diets. I always say, many of us have crash dieted in our lives. I have yo-yoed in my weight for a long time. We all know that you could crash diet and I could lose an absolute fortune and look fantastic in that wedding dress that I want to be in a few weeks or whatever it might be. But I'm going to put the weight back on, minutes after I start scoffing on the chips. But actually, I know that if it might take me a year or 18 months, but if I changed my lifestyle and did things in a healthier way, I would lose a little bit of weight each time, but it'd be more sustainable. And I think we've got into this culture of wanting quick fixes and needing everything now, but actually, particularly organisationally, better to just slowly take a bite, chip, and help people make meaningful, sustainable change, rather than changing everything overnight. And it sticks for 2 minutes and it goes. And particularly organisations like health, local authorities, they have huge initiative fatigue. This week's motivational interviewing, next week is signs of safety, next week is the next sexy thing. And so people have exhaustion over it.
Yeah. And I guess it's about, a lot. I mean, God, I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel like I'm talking about something and I want to caveat it by saying it's not, this is not new. It's not rocket science. It's not complicated. This is actually just about humanity a lot of the time. This is about how we connect with each other. So that's really interesting. And I think we need to, part of 2020 for me is very much about how we're connecting and how we're using relationships to create shifts and change, because we've just been through so much divisiveness and division. So the other thing that I think is really helpful for people to unpick, and I'm often having this conversation, is around the notion of being trauma aware, trauma informed, trauma responsive, and I think it's you who's named that a trauma river, which I really like, that kind of flow, and it helps people understand where they are on the journey. So do you want to talk to us a bit about that?
So I suppose, just in a sense of why I called it a trauma river. So I called it a trauma river because I wanted people to have the sense of it's a journey, it's an ongoing journey. Sometimes it can be really messy. Sometimes it can flow beautifully. Sometimes there can be big boulders and rocks in the way. Sometimes we can flow and swim in the journey. Other times we need to get off and go onto the riverbank. And you can have one drop of water at one end and another drop of water at the other end. And it's this sense of that it's lots of drops together. So I think that's kind of why I came up, and you can play a lot with the river metaphor. But in essence, it starts with trauma sensitive, goes to trauma aware, it goes to trauma informed, and then there's trauma responsive. And it doesn't end at trauma responsive. It's an deep thing in trauma responsive. it's in a continual, that some of the organizations I was working with in America, 30 years, it's on a daily basis. They're thinking, how are we keeping this alive? How are we infusing it in our practice? So that's in essence. But I think where people get confused is also they think you're either trauma sensitive or you're trauma aware, and actually the model and the notion is you could be trauma sensitive on one area of your organization, but trauma responsive on another. So, for example, if you have trained everyone in your organization on an introduction to trauma and there's a real good shared language, you might be quite far along the river around training, fantastic, around knowledge exchange. But if you have policies and practices that are restrictive, constrictive, trauma inducing, you're not even at the trauma sensitive side of the river.
And that's what's so frustrating as someone who goes and gives training. And I know you've shifted a lot in the way that you do that, because you can find yourself going into organizations for a day and it can feel a little bit like everyone's gone, right, we've done that. We're now trauma informed and we've done attachment. People who tell me they've done attachment, I always giggle, like, really? How do you do it? How have you done that?
Yes.
So, and I guess that was something you were picking up as you were kind of doing your thing.
Huge. And I think we have to be incredibly careful. I think we are in a tipping scale of something potentially amazing and a paradigm shift being diluted and being misinterpreted, because it has become the buzzword and it has been being misused and used to get financial contracts and popped on a website, and that means it's trauma informed, or putting a nice fruit bowl on a reception area and that means it's trauma informed. And I think if we want it to be something meaningful, we just don't need to overclaim. Actually, being trauma sensitive is a phenomenal step for many organizations. Let's try and get that really good, and let's then help people look at the journey. And people are using trauma responsive a lot, and there's a big difference. Trauma informed, a lot of it is about knowing, but trauma responsive is about doing, it's about being, and it's about sustainability. If you have an organization with 5 amazing people who are like, absolutely, this is where we're going, if those 5 people leave, is the organization going to stay with these ideas of trauma infused into the fabric of the organization? Is it in the culture? Is it in the policies? Is it in the practice? Is it in the interactions and the practices? If it's not trauma responsive.
It's that way of knowing to that way of being, and that's something that I've felt I need to talk about a lot, because I have situations in front of me where I know that person has a lot of knowledge, and yet their response to something or their reaction to something is not infusing that knowledge. And I know people who are very famous in this world who do that, and that's okay, because we all make mistakes. But then if we've got that knowledge, then we know that part of that recovery from that is repairing that, and saying I'm really sorry, my central nervous system got the better of me on that occasion.
Completely.
Yeah.
It is, and I was in some residential homes just before Christmas, and they were saying to me, oh yes, we're really thinking about trauma and we're doing emotional regulation. I was like, oh, that's amazing. And then I went and observed practice, and that wasn't seen in the practice. And I think there is one thing about the information, but there is another embodying it and infusing it and how it feels. And I think, that's my favorite quote of Maya Angelou, of people forget what you do and forget what you say, but they remember how you make them feel. And that's what I'm interested when I go into a residential home. How do the kids feel? How do they feel that people see them, hear them, notice them? You might have a trauma lens, and that's fantastic, but it's how that then translates into actually doing something differently. And I think that's the bit that takes a lot more than a one-off training.
And that quote opened up my book, The Brightness of Stars. Because I mean, and I think, I wonder how, to me, until we get past them and us, because that's what it is for me. It's about not believing that you are the same as that person, that it's somehow the policies and procedures and ways of working that are embedded in so many services are really still very much caught up on othering.
Yeah.
And where do we start with that? Where do we start? I mean, when you go into a large organisation, where do you begin when you want to really kind of get people to a place where they are willing to accept that they are othering? Because that's a big thing for a start, isn't it?
Huge. Well, that's, I think, the premise of cultural humility, actually, is about power and privilege and othering and positioning, dehumanizing people, and really thinking about whose voices are privileged, whose voices are neglected, whose voices are silenced. What are we doing to be inclusive and not exclusive? I think that is at the crux of it. That's what cultural humility is. And actually, I'll say a bit about what I do when I go into an organisation, but if you talk about one of my biggest passions and bugbears, is actually people are putting trauma-informed separate to thinking about culture, but actually trauma-informed comes from a social justice background. It comes from a human rights background. You cannot talk about being trauma-informed if you don't think about cultural humility. If you're not, and I think people then think cultural humility is race, but they don't realise it's about the intersection of all those different parts of identities. But a lot of it, almost all of it, is about power, and it's about seeing everyone with their unique value as an expert of their own experience, thinking about what do I look and bring differently to someone else. So my biggest hope in a lot of what I do in my organisational trainings is to really infuse and bring together ideas of trauma and ideas about culture and identity, and that you can't have one without the other. They're hand in hand. And I think the trauma stuff has got a buzz, but it seems to have slightly been separated.
It's almost like it's been kind of watered down into something really palatable, isn't it? Because actually it's not palatable, it's uncomfortable, and it's self-inquiring, and that whole coming out of a social justice perspective is why this year I'm investing a lot in relational activism as a way of being, because that feels to me more aligned than where trauma-informed has gone in the last year. And it's so good to have this conversation, because I was left at the end of the year just thinking, where are we? Where are we? And how do we bring this back to what it is? Because if people cannot align and understand where they're coming from with their own value base, then how are they going to work that within the organisation that they're working in? It's like either you're in this or you're not in this. Where are you? And I do check in with myself a lot, and that's why it's so lovely to have this conversation, albeit very publicly on a podcast.
I almost forgot we were doing a podcast.
I know, I thought I'd just like chatting away. But I think when you are very conscious and aware of your own personal experience and what you bring to the conversation, and on some level you've worked through that, I mean, I don't know enough about you or anyone else really, but I know for me, I've spent many years working through all of that, and I'm very comfortable with what I bring that comes from that place. But actually, that's not the case for lots of people. There's and if you're not bringing those kind of experiences, and yet you're working in environments that are asking you to really look at and think about those things, that's really challenging as well, isn't it?
And it's also don't know why, but a quote from Elvis Presley has popped into my head. But he said, which I think is actually genius, is, values are like fingerprints. We leave them over everything. And I think it's so true in terms of, if you're not able to look at your own lens and your own kaleidoscope and your own vulnerabilities and hotspots, how can you do that for other people? But how can we appreciate difference? And I think it's also that sense of realizing that, particularly with teams, you're working with so many different people. Everyone's coming in with their own principles, values, experiences, and that's going to massive colour everything that people are looking at. So absolutely, without having that reflective lens and that inward lens, I think, and how can you then do it for other people? How can I meaningfully talk to a child about being curious if I'm not curious? How can I support a child to think if I'm not thinking? So it's kind of that modeling the model, isn't it? I think that's a huge sense. So yeah, I think that's a massive bit. And I think the other area, if we're talking about dilution, is when we think about, I start all of my trauma trainings with an infographic that many people would see about the different types of trauma. And I say to people, look, we're going to spend 2 days talking about relational and developmental trauma. But actually what I'm not getting to talk about is single event trauma, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, birth and medical trauma, combat-related trauma, disfranchised grief, all community trauma, vicarious trauma, that actually, again, that's not being trauma informed. When I always start, I say this is an introduction into relational and developmental trauma. When I do my long trauma courses, we do an introduction onto all those different types of trauma. So even when you use the word trauma informed, it's actually thinking, well, what type of trauma might you be more sensitive or informed to? Because just because someone knows a lot about domestic violence, that doesn't mean that someone actually knows about trauma. It's a particular area. And I think we just need to think really carefully about what are we focusing on. And it's okay. People don't need to know all of those different bits, but just using the words carefully so that we're not losing that, and that we're bringing it back to the values, the relationships at the heart of it. That's what it's about. It's about connection. It's about relationships. It's about not doing more harm. And I do think now, particularly with our community probably being the most split and polarized it's been in a long time, which I would think is community trauma in some ways, it's more important than ever to also think about what are those pockets that bring people together.
Yeah, and that's the work of 2020, but I think it's the work of the decade ahead. How do we pull all of us back together, and how do we think about, I think one of the things when I'm thinking about all of that comes to mind is privilege and being comfortable with locating your own privileges. And I guess that's what I often see missing in some of the conversations, but that actually, in order to have a deep enough conversation that would mean you could explore that so the other person felt safe, is outside of the context of a training room full of 125 people. And that's the difficulty, isn't it? How do you, like I was, some of the sentences that have very much been around the disconnection that comes from isolation in an education setting are very much sound bites about protecting the other children. They have a right to be protected. One person described isolation as a commune in a communal way, which I thought was a bit of an oxymoron. I'm not sure how you do isolation communally. It's all a bit strange. Yeah. But yeah, lots of kind of sound bites. And I just thought, this is the privilege of either not having been that child. This is the privilege of not having that child that you're living with 24 hours a day. This is the privilege of not working with that child in your therapy room. At the end of the day, these are privileges. And I'm really comfortable with people getting that stuff wrong. It's really not a problem to me. I am the biggest human mistake factory maker of all time, and I'm totally comfortable with that about myself. And I'm always hopeful that, you know, that other people are okay with all of my flaws as well, to the best that we can. But you know, that's really difficult, isn't it? You know, in people not wanting to make mistakes, not seeming like they can make mistakes, and actually just saying, actually, maybe I've got this wrong, or maybe, you know, this isn't right, and how can we do this differently?
Well, that's a huge thing. And I think where I find that's happening more is, talking of privilege slightly in a different way, but I have the privilege of working with a lot of organisations through consultation. And I think that's where, you know, I do the big training events, and we all get that baseline. But then I'm getting to go to groups of 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, and really try and go into the nuts and bolts and really try and create that psychological safety, that moral safety, that cultural safety. Lots of where people are able to actually start to really reflect and not see it as a attack or a criticism, but just start to think and do it in that way. And I think that has been the highlight of my 2019, and hopefully will continue to be, is when you actually are able to take those ideas and really get people to self-reflect. And I've got a bunch of questions I created around cultural humility, and I've just been picking one, you know, and we've been spending 3, 4, 5 hours just on this question in a creative way. We've been doing it through clay, we've been doing it through posters, through making patchworks, and I think just helping people to start to think about that has been amazing. It's been some of my best sparkle moments. Very difficult to do that on a big forum, but I think it is that sense of, as you say, being able to own your own mistakes and vulnerability, but also that it's just human and we learn from them rather than people feeling. And that's about safety, isn't it? If people work in an organisation where they feel it's fear or blaming, or that they're going to be seen as too weak, or all of these different things, people learn to put up these different things. And we know fear restricts creativity, doesn't it? Fear restricts innovation. So I think it's all about that emotional regulation and safety first, to then allow people to start doing some of those thinkings. And for that, the organisational culture needs to allow it. So it's a long talk of the river. That's kind of why it's a river, because it's a long journey on that.
Yeah.
But I think I am starting to really see people start to think of those things. And there's a quote I always use, which is, you know, you don't take fences down until you honour and celebrate why they were put up in the first place. And I think that's a massive thing when we're working individually, but also organisationally.
I think that's a really big takeaway, actually, to ponder, you know, what was it about those things that the organisation needed, in the same way as when you're working on yourself and you're thinking, I don't need to have that behaviour anymore. It protected me for a long time and I don't need to have it now. It's the same thing, isn't it? We had to have this type of behaviour in our organisation to feel safe, but we don't need to have it anymore.
Exactly.
I think that is such a huge place to end, actually, the conversation, because if people can take that away and really unpick that and have a think about that, I think that's something that could create really quite large shifts.
I hope so.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's been fabulous talking to you.
Always lovely talking to you. Thank you.